When I was a kid, I used to jump off my bed, not step off onto the floor, because I didn't want the boogeyman to grab my leg. I would jump as far as I could and keep running. I eventually outgrew that. I don't remember when it happened. I just remember the days when I used to jump and run. Now, as a parent, I have a son that is afraid of the boogeyman under his bed. How is it that millions of kids around the world are afraid of the boogeyman under their bed? Is it instinct? Do kids know something, see something, and sense something that we adults cannot? So last night I was in my son Andy's room, comforting him, telling him there is no monster under his bed. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the scared look in his eyes it wasn't doing any good just to tell him nothing was there. I laid down on the bed with him to help him go to sleep. I felt a bump from under the bed. It was light and faint, but I felt it. I ignored it. It was a spring popping or something. He wailed and said, "There it is, Daddy." I shushed him, told him it was nothing, but then we felt it again. And again, harder. I'm an adult. I'm logical. So I got us both up and pulled the mattress off the bed. If there was a cat or squirrel or rat or whatever, I was going to put an end to this. I tipped the box spring up on its side. There was nothing under the bed except Andy's car collection. I looked all over the box spring looking for a hole an animal could get into. Nothing. I kicked it a few times to get the springs back into shape. Then put the bed back together. And 10 minutes later, it started again. Andy just clung to me as hard as he could. I didn't understand what could be making the bumping under the bed. I still don't understand, but it was weird and haunting, and I got scared myself. I don't remember the bed making any bumping when I was a kid, but I do remember various times through my life, even as an adult, when the bed was vibrating. I could even tell what corner of the bed the vibrating was coming from. I never felt like it was an angel or something good. I always felt like it was something bad. So I laid a blanket out on the floor where the mattress would have been, inside the bed frame. The mattress I threw over against the wall. I was going to show Andy there was no such thing as a boogeyman. Despite his crying, I made him lie down with me on the blanket. How can there be bumping under the bed when I'm under the bed myself? There can't, obviously, but apparently all that does is force the boogeyman out and makes him mad. First the door slammed shut so loud I sat straight up, almost knocking Andy aside. Then the door locked, and then I saw him. The boogeyman, at least this boogeyman, is a big guy. I had the impression he was dressed in old clothes, but it was too dark to tell for sure. The horror of being there on the floor with my young son screaming and hanging on for dear life while this thing walked over and stared down at me. There was no thought of my putting up a fight or protest. It wasn't possible and didn't enter my mind. All I could think of was I was going to die and could I save my son from the same fate. But the boogeyman didn't attack. He didn't do anything except stand there above me and look down at the two of us cowering on the blanket. He stood there so long without moving that I had time to come to my senses a bit. I saw that there was no sign of movement, no breathing, no wavering of arms. His eyes, though it was dark, came across as being paler than his face was. So I sat, and so he stood, until I got the impression he was waiting for me. I was afraid to move, but Andy was starting to calm down a bit. Not that he wasn't afraid. This was a horrifying experience, but he stopped screaming at least. I started to think, what was the boogeyman waiting for? And then I had an idea. Slowly, so slowly, I crept away from the boogeyman, holding Andy in my arms. We got away from the bed, and I stood up. I went to the mattress and box spring, and setting Andy down briefly, threw them both back onto the bed. Then I grabbed up Andy and ran from the room. It seems to be the boogeyman only wanted his spot back that I had taken away from him. He wanted underneath the bed. I haven't been back in the room again. We're moving. Whatever you do, don't take away the boogeyman's spot. My mother died when I was 8 years old. I wasn't prepared for it, even though I should have realized what was coming. I was about as clueless as a kid can possibly be in most aspects of life, and this was no exception. She had been sick for a long time. So sick that for the last few years of her life, she was completely bedridden. The family used a pair of walkie-talkies so she could call for help from one room to the next if she needed anything. If she was left at home alone, we'd give one of the walkie-talkies to the next-door neighbor. It was just something we came up with as sort of a wireless intercom system. I remember the day I got called out of class at school to take a phone call. It was a phone call from Dad. He said Mom was very sick and I should come home. I remember being happy to get out of school early for the day. I remember thinking that Mom was always really sick and then wondering why this day was any different, that I should get out of school. There were a lot of people there when I got home. For some reason, I wasn't allowed into Mom's room. So I picked up the walkie-talkie off the kitchen table and took it to my room. I pressed the button. Mom, what's going on? There was no answer. Mom, still no answer. A moment later, my oldest brother opened the door to my room and walked over to where I was sitting on my bed with the walkie-talkie. He reached down and switched it off and shook his head. Then he turned around and left. That was it. Thinking back, I guess I should have realized at least by then that she was dead. But I didn't. I didn't even really understand what death was. A couple of days later, we were getting ready for Mom's funeral. I remember it being explained to me that Mom's body would be there, and there would be music and sort of a church service where we were going. Back before Mom got sick, she'd go to church and she often took her tape recorder and recorded the sermons. I mentioned that I'd like to take Mom's tape recorder so I could record this service. The family decided against it and put the tape recorder away. So I didn't tell anyone when I took her walkie-talkie off her nightstand and slipped it into my pocket to give to her at the funeral. At the service, we each got a moment to go to Mom's casket. She looked like she was sleeping very peacefully. I pulled the walkie-talkie out of my pocket and tucked it beside her so she could call if she needed anything. No one paid any attention to what I had done. Everyone seemed to just be comforting each other. When I went to sit down, I pulled my handkerchief from my jacket pocket and handed it to my crying grandmother, just as I had seen adults do in movies I'd watched. I listened to the singing and to the sermon, and we all went outside for another short service, and then we went home. That night, I turned on my walkie-talkie and listened for Mom in case she needed anything. I fell asleep listening to the intermittent static. But then her unmistakable voice woke me. I opened my eyes and sat up in my bed. Still gripping the walkie-talkie in my hand, I pressed the button. Mom. You need something? Beneath the static, like a distant call, I heard her voice again, as if she were barely within range. I just need to talk to you about something, honey, she said. She and I talked for what then seemed like only a few minutes, but looking back, I know it must have taken much longer. The exact conversation we had is very personal to me, but suffice it to say that from that night on, I understood what it meant when someone dies. For the first time, I realized I wouldn't see her again for the rest of my life. For the first time, I cried in realization that she was really gone. But I also knew she was no longer sick and no longer suffering. I began to fall asleep, so she said goodbye. It's my fault for starting to fall asleep. To this day, when I think about it, I am still so disappointed in myself for getting so tired. For the next couple of nights, I tried to talk to her again on the walkie-talkie. I love you and I miss you, I kept telling her. After getting home from school the next afternoon, I noticed that many of Mom's things were gone, even things I'd put in my room that belonged to her. Her old Sunday school teaching materials, a blanket that she kept on her lap when she used to get around in a wheelchair, and the walkie-talkie were all missing from my room. My grandmother on my dad's side of the family had disposed of these things thinking it would be easier for us to get on with our lives. Whether or not the walkie-talkie would have ever worked to speak to her again, I'll never know. But I'll always be thankful for that one last conversation. Hello, my name is Stephanie, and I am going to share with you the most terrifying week of my life. When I was about 6 years old, I had this intense fear of my closet. I always felt as if someone or something was in it. I never wanted to sleep in my own room because I was so afraid of it. This all started the day I found out that the previous owner of my house died in my room. At this time, being only 6, I thought nothing of it. But I would soon become a believer in the paranormal. That night, my mom had just put me to bed and I was having a really hard time sleeping. The way my room was set up was my bed was on the opposite wall of the closet, so if I turned on my side, I was facing my closet. My fear was super intense that night. I felt like there was someone in my room with me, but I didn't know what to do. So I just shut my eyes and tried to get some sleep. Well, that didn't happen. I made the mistake of rolling over, facing my closet, and I opened my eyes, just in time to see a shadowy figure dart across the wall and stop where my closet door was. The figure was odd. If I had to describe it, it looked like a troll shape. It was small, but I was terrified. I just laid there. I didn't want to move at all. I felt my breathing was too much movement. I decided to look over at my closet once more, and the door begins to open. Slowly, it gets to the point where it can't open anymore and slams shut. So what do? I freak out, of course, and run to my mom. That night, I slept in my parents' bed. The next night wasn't too bad, but I was still frightened. Because of the previous night, I decided that I would feel safer if my little dog, Princess, slept in bed with me. Princess was a Pomeranian and really sweet. I was in bed and I already felt tons safer because Princess was there with me. I was petting her before I was about to pass out, but I remember blinking and opening my eyes again, and what I saw scared me enough to start screaming. As I opened my eyes to look at Princess, she turned black. Her fur is really light tan, and her eyes were glowing red. Believe me, I know how weird this sounds. I didn't want to believe it either, but I know what I saw. So needless to say, I kicked Princess out of my room, and she slept in the living room that night. The next night is a night I will never forget. I was laying in bed, almost about to fall asleep, when I hear my name coming from the closet. At first, I thought it was my mom, so I listened one more time. Nothing. So I roll back over and start to fall asleep. Later, I woke to something shaking my bed. At that time, I had a water bed, and it would move easily from anything trying to move it. That night, it was moving to the point where I felt I was going to fall off. No one was in my room but me. Why was my bed moving like that? I was scared, so I hopped out of bed and started running towards my door. I slammed shut it in my face. I was frozen with fear. I just stood there. I didn't want to turn around because I didn't know what would happen to me if I did. I start to hear my name coming from the closet again. Just repeating until finally it stops. The door opens and I run to my mom. The whole time I was in my room that night, I felt depressed. I felt like something wanted me to feel that way. Like I was alone, helpless. Years have gone by and nothing happened. My family and I moved to a new house. One day I remember asking my mom about the person who died in our old house. She told me it was an old woman. She had died in my room, right next to my closet. She was trying to get help, but she couldn't get out of the room. She was helpless.